Okay, today we're going to be talking about something that is essential when you're thinking about constructing your cabin, your cottage in the woods, or your garden, your place of safety, your place where you might want to escape and feel some sense of security. And really what we're getting at here is the idea of land. Land is something that a lot of people think that is kind of out of their reach. Oftentimes when they're considering, maybe building a second home or a cabin or something like that. But it's not all that expensive, relatively speaking. Of course, it does depend on the area of the country that you live in. I just got back from Alaska a couple of weeks ago, and really had a great time. Got to see a lot of different cabin styles. The so-called button pass type of cabin, and in some cases I saw some hand-hewn cabins, although they are not quite as common. But I saw a lot of land and not a lot of people, as you would imagine. Alaska is a beautiful, wide open space, and that's unique, of course, compared to what you might see on the east coast of the United States. As is, and I've been to places like Montana, and Oregon and Washington State, and really, although not nearly as sparsely populated as a place like Alaska, it is still, relatively speaking, when you compare it with the East Coast, fairly sparsely populated. So that being said, in places where there is a lower demand for property, in places where it's going to be sparsely populated, you're going to see a lower price. Now, of course, on the East Coast, there's a lot of people. Most of the country's population is concentrated on the East Coast, and I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. We are seeing a land boom, a housing boom take place across the country, and we are particularly seeing higher and higher prices on the East Coast. So, having said that, it's still doable to get affordable land, but again, that could change in the not too distant future. So now, if you're going to get land, you probably want to narrow down where you want to get it, and you want to do your due diligence and look for property basically as often as you possibly can. Go to websites like Realtor.com and Zillow. Maybe your local real estate agencies are going to be able to give you some insight. And then, of course, if you have a particular area that you have in mind, you might want to look at the local real estate agencies, obviously, in that area to see what they have on hand, and also see what kind of prices you're going to be dealing with. Now, having said that, obviously, that's the first step, is buying the property. But before you even do that, before you even buy that property, you have to think about what kind of property is it that you want? What kind of things is it that you're going to need on that property in order to, have something like maybe a small homestead or a sort of getaway cabin. Some might call it a bug-out cabin. I hate to use that term because I'm not a prepper. I'm just somebody that likes to be cautious and likes to think ahead. When I started thinking about building a cabin, I started about thinking about all the different things that I would want if I had a quiet location. It took me a long time. I looked around at different places. Obviously, I wanted some place that was remote, had access, and had availability of water if possible, yet at the same time still had access, not just in terms of roads, but in terms of internet, maybe cell phone reception, although those things aren't, they're not a deal killer for me. But that may be something that you'd be considering when you're thinking about purchasing your property. So water is a big issue. When you're going to buy your property, you want to think about availability of water, and there are different ways that you can obtain water. It doesn't have to be in the form of public utility. Obviously, if you're out in the country, you're not likely going to have access to public water. So that means the next step is having to dig a well. Wells can be all over the place in terms of cost. I've seen them cost, in my research, cost a few $1,000s all the way up to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the terrain that they're going to be drilling in, how deep they have to go. If you're in a more mountainous terrain, it's possible they may have to go deeper for water, and that's going to be more costly. So you need to think about that. If you don't want to go the route of a well because of the expense, I can understand that. You can also look at things like, and you can't quite see it in the video there, but behind me there is a small, I don't even know that I'd call it a stream right now. I'd call it a brook, maybe. It is a small stream that is supplied by, I believe, about 3 springs. And we are in the dry time of the year, so not all of those springs are running, or at least not at a high flow rate. And so it's just, at this moment, it's just more or less of a trickle. But you need to consider the flow rate compared to the flow rate you might have out of your spigot at a house in town. And I can tell you, even though it doesn't look like it, I'm probably getting about the same flow rate, maybe slightly greater than the flow rate I get out of my faucet at home, where I have availability of public water. So that's a great way of getting water. Obviously, if you're going to be getting it from a creek, you can't just drink it out of the creek. You need to filter it. You need to treat it. And there are lots of different ways to do that. You can create your own filtration system, but you're still going to need to use some sort of a purification for that. There's the availability of a lot of different types of UV lights online. They're not too expensive. Some of them are actually fairly cheap, but they can be expensive if you want a nicer version. So that's a way to go, but obviously you're going to have some sort of a filtration prior to even using the UV light. UV only works if the water is clear enough so that the UV light can penetrate through it completely and kill all of the pathogens in it. You may think, and I've heard this from a lot of different people over the years, that if you have availability of a clean creek or a spring, that water doesn't need to be treated, and that is absolutely false. Just because people have consumed water from streams or creeks maybe and not gotten sick doesn't mean that they're safe. That could have been just luck of the draw. So there are 2 or 3 different types of things that you have to worry about in terms of water contaminants. One is Giardia, the other is Cryptosporidium, and the other is E. coli. Just depends on what the water has been exposed to. You have to think about, if you're looking at a creek like this, it comes from 2 or 3 springs that are up the mountain that are probably a quarter mile away. And you have to think about all the things that have touched that water since they have come out of the earth. You could have dead animals up there. I've seen dead animals along this creek, small and large. You can, of course, you have fish in there that can contaminate it, crayfish, etc. You have leaf matter that is blown into the water, and as leaf matter starts to break down for any of you that have had it get into your rain barrels, it is foul. It smells like sewage, basically, when it's breaking down. So you definitely don't want to just drink that. So you want to have to purify it. And as I said, really the same thing goes for springs as well. The state of, for instance, West Virginia, and I think Virginia too, if you drink out of, or if you have a spring that supplies your home with water, it is a requirement that you have a UV light or some sort of an improved purification system for that water, because even if it's coming out of the ground, there are still opportunities for things like rodents that will often burrow into the ground to get in there and contaminate it. You can have fecal matter in it, you can have snakes in there, etc., and all sorts of ways that water could be contaminated. So it's got to be treated, whether it's a stream or a creek, or a spring rather, it's got to be treated. The other possibility, we've talked about a couple of different sources of water, is the idea of a rain catchment system. And I know that sounds like a headache, but it's not all that difficult. I've looked, I've read a lot about different rain catchment systems. You more commonly see them in arid areas of the country, of the world, places like Australia and the Southwest United States. But they are very effective at gathering enough water for even say a 4-person family to use. You just have to take into account the water that you're using, be conscious of the water that you're using. As I mentioned, I just got back from Alaska recently, and my wife and I experienced for the first time in an area that is really devoid of a lot of water. We stayed in a series of what they call dry cabins. And a dry cabin, for those of you that are not familiar with that term, is just a cabin that doesn't have access to water. And we had to have that water brought into us by the people that we rented our cottage from every couple of days. So we started off, they gave us 3 5-gallon bottles of water. We went through that pretty quickly. Like it took us like just a couple of days to go through that. When you think about things like washing dishes and having to wash yourself, brush your teeth, wash your hands, etc. You go through water pretty quickly. I think the average American uses, now again, people in America are on the high end of this, but uses about 87 gallons of water per day. And we were able to, we didn't use quite as much after we realized how quickly we were going through the water, and we kind of got used to that scenario, but we got it to the point where we were using about 4 gallons of water per person. And it ended up, we were not too far from a national park. We were near Denali National Park, so we actually had access to water there that we could take and fill up our shower bag and a spare water bottle that we had with us, and that helped to offset the water issue. But if you haven't ever stayed in a dry cabin, you're thinking about the water situation, it's a good way to kind of test yourself, to see how you can deal with it, to see just how much water that you need from day to day. And think about things like, as I said, dishwashing, washing your hands, obviously, after using the bathroom, that sort of thing. You're going to need to think about those things. Or for those of you that have been backpacking, and I have done a lot of backpacking in my life, and that's very similar, obviously, to staying in a dry cabin. Oftentimes, you just don't have access to water, and you have to pack it out, or pack it in rather. And hopefully, if you're out there on the trail, maybe you have access to a stream or something like that, and you can filter water or treat it. So those are the big issues. You also want to think about things like roads. It's as I said, accessibility, and that is kind of there are 2 components, maybe more, regarding the idea of accessibility. One is you want to have a main road that comes into the property, right? Maybe it's a state maintained road that comes near the property that can get you in a ballpark area where the property is. But then you have to think about things like driveways. Driveways are really underrated, and they are expensive. As I said, we looked at a lot of different properties over the course of the last year or so, and that was something that came to the fore very quickly. The idea of needing an accessible driveway, and driveways can cost tens of thousands of dollars to have constructed. In some cases, they can be very expensive. It doesn't mean they will be that expensive, but they can be very expensive. So you definitely want to get some estimates when you're thinking about different property. And obviously, if you're having to move quickly on that property because it's going quickly, you're going to have to get those estimates quickly if you really want to put that into the mix in terms of considerations. One thing that we had to our benefit on this property, and definitely other properties that we looked at and we almost purchased, was the use of a logging road. We had an old logging road that ran through the property, hadn't been used in years. It was covered with fallen trees and debris, and there were some, I don't know if you can see around me, but there are quite a bit of blueberry heaths that grow under the ground, and they pop up all over the place, and they were popping up all over the road. So last weekend we came out with just a weed eater and some different tools, and I began to remove all of that, and that road is pretty well clear now. It's pretty from there's one more component to this, but from almost the beginning of the entrance to where I am right now, it's clear, and you could drive a Honda Civic or whatever down here with no issues whatsoever. The entrance is an issue. We need to have a culvert installed in order to actually get to the logging road. It's not a very big section, and it shouldn't be too expensive to have that installed, but it's something that we will need to have done relatively soon. Other things you want to think about is timber. I know that right now, speaking in 2021, timber is very expensive. We've seen the price of wood go up exponentially during the pandemic, and it's beginning to appear as if it might be coming down somewhat. Fingers crossed, but we'll see. So when you're thinking about what type of home you want to build and you want to do what I'm doing, construct it yourself, think about the cost of timber and think about the availability of timber that you have to you. Now, I'm speaking to you from the East Coast, and I can tell you in the region where I purchased property, I've got a lot of timber, a lot of really good timber, and you want to consider the different types of timber that you have there. I've got a lot of red oak, which is really kind of a family of oak. And it is made up of pin oak and black oak and things like that. And I've got a lot of white oak, which is like the creme de la creme in this area of wood that you would want to use to build something like a log cabin, because it is very sturdy, it's very dense, it's very pretty, but it's also very rot and insect resistant, which is high on the list when you're considering things that you would want to use in the construction of your home or your recreational cabin or whatever. I have been removing trees that have fallen on the ground here, and they probably fell to the ground 30 years ago. And I'm finding that once you get beyond, scratch beyond the exterior where there's some rot, some insect damage, the core is actually still very solid. And these trees are still very heavy too. In some cases there's water in them, but in other cases it's just they're heavy because they're still very dense. I've read different studies that were done by the Forest Service that have compared the different types of wood that you can use to build things like log cabins, and white oak is it's right up there at the top. It's something that will last probably around 30 years. Even if it's just laying on the ground. If you keep it up off the ground, and we'll talk about cabin construction and foundations and things like that, it can last basically indefinitely. They're remarkably resistant to rot and decay. Red oak, it gets a bad rap by some woodworkers because it does have open pores. And you can see that if you look at red oak on the ends when you make a cut, you'll see that it has these little openings, and those openings can take up water, and that can lead to rot. However, it's still much more rot resistant than things like pine or fir or hemlock, all things that have been used to construct cabins over the years. Red oak is said to last, according to the study that I read, from the Forest Service about 25 years before it begins to show serious signs of decay when laying on the ground. Now, if it's elevated, it's still going to last quite a while. And then there are other things that you can do to wood as well to allow for it to last a longer period of time. Obviously, you want to think about topography. And if you're looking around, I can spin the camera here. And if you're looking around this area, you may not be able to make it out on the cabin, but there is no visibility from the main road leading to this area to where I am located right now. And that's a good thing. It was one thing that I was looking into when I was considering buying property. I didn't want where I was going to have the cabin. I didn't want people to be able to see it when they were just driving down the road. If you're looking at it from a distance, it just looks like a wooded area with hills around it. So it's kind of like a little fort. It's a hollow, basically, with the stream running down through it. So that was also something to consider. As I mentioned, accessibility to things like internet can be important for people. If you want to, even if, let's say that everything's fine, nothing happens for this, this sort of escapist mentality to need to take hold. You got a great place just to come and enjoy on the weekends. Sometimes I come out here, we've just purchased the property, haven't even built a cabin yet. I've just done some minimal maintenance to it, but I'll just come out here and sit and enjoy it with my wife. And it is just a remarkable place. I love backpacking, as I said. I love hiking, but a lot of times when you're hiking, particularly on the East Coast, particularly during the pandemic, you don't get the privacy that you sometimes crave. That can also be true on the West Coast too. I've been to Glacier National Park, and I've been to Denali, as I said, and been out around Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens and into Washington State, etc. And those areas can get pretty crowded. You don't have to worry about that in a spot like this because it's not frequented by as many people, and obviously, it's your property and you've got some protection from prying eyes outside of it. So, just some different things to think about. Think about things like we have FiOS, which is very close to us, so we could get internet access pretty easily doing that, or you could go with Starlink. And again, I'm not promoting any particular brand. I really don't care about any particular brand, but Starlink is pretty great because they use low orbit satellites. It's different from the type of satellite internet we've seen in the past. For those of you that are familiar with it, it's related to work that Elon Musk's team has done, his company has done. The only catch to it is that you need to have clearance, so you can't have trees in the way of your satellite receiver. So you need to make sure that is not an issue. And we're looking south right now, so usually, and I can't say for certain, but usually you want to have south-facing clarity for those things to work. So you may have to knock down a few trees in order for that to work, and you may need to elevate the satellite receiver as well. So just some different things to think about. So we'll talk more about the different components about land later on, but that's all I've got for today. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you've gotten some good information over the course of this video.